Many things and good morning from my side. Let me quickly add a few words to my person. So I'm Christian. We founded Micobo in 2014, and ever since we focused on distributed ledger technology. So we're a certified Corda solution provider with a strong focus on Corda and apparently also on Solidity because we do in ICOs. And last year we made the decision to take on board a security token offering, which is quite a challenge, and I'm here today to basically tell you everything you want to know about security token offerings, what is the difference to ICOs, and just give you some guidance. Yeah. And just give you some guidance in case you are currently considering doing a security token offering. The next 45 minutes will be about a few basics, so we're going to start very smoothly and then have a look at the history of ICOs, because that's very interesting. What has happened over the last couple of months? How is the industry evolving, which is also very important? And what could be the future of ICOs, token generation events, but also security token offerings? And whilst doing so, I want to try to answer one question. Can security token offerings be a new way and substitute eventually private equity and venture capital? We made some very interesting experiences whilst going on roadshow for this specific security token, and it's completely different to a standard ICO. This is at least our experience. So whenever you have any questions in the course of the presentation, just shoot. I'm happy to answer them whilst we go through the pitch. So I think everybody knows what an ICO is, so we can skip that one. What's important to say here is that I clearly distinguish between an ICO and a security token offering. So an ICO is, in my eyes, at least with regard to this presentation, a utility token and not regulated in terms of financial laws or investment laws regulated token generation events. A security token offering, in comparison to that one, is like issuing a security. And that's quite interesting. So it's very small, but it just basically gives you an impression about how many different blockchain technologies and different tokens and different models we have in that ecosystem. So, and even if we think, well, that's confusing, just imagine what the regulator thinks. So it's a massive challenge to just keep on track with all the recent developments on the market. So for example, we have blockchain platforms, but then there are also things like, for example, stable coins. And then we've got currencies. So you can easily get confused, and that makes it not easy for you as a company planning to do an ICO, but especially for the regulator. So when we just look at the term security token, what is it? So as I said, we have tokens issued in a token generation event, and we've got utility tokens, and I also would consider a cryptocurrency as a sort of utility token. And this is probably the most common standard in the industry right now, utility tokens. And then on the other side, we've got security tokens. And this is quite interesting because we have, on the one hand side, we have asset-backed tokens, for example, stablecoins, which is basically nothing else than a certificate, for example. So we have gold-backed tokens. That sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? ETCs, exchange-traded commodities. So why on the one hand side is an ETC regulated? And on the other hand side, we're starting to discuss whether an asset-backed token is regulated or not. That just makes no sense at all to me. But it also shows that we're already dealing with sort of securities, and that the industry is evolving, that we're not only speaking about pure utility tokens, but that something is happening. That we start to actually put an underlying, attach it to a token. And then we've got something that is very rare still on the market, which is an equity token. So quite similar to a share, for example. And there's also something in between, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And what's important to mention here is that basically an asset-backed token is more sort of certificate, which is physically based on an underlying. And an equity token is really comparable to a share, with all its rights and obligations for the issuer. The problem with equity tokens, at least in Germany, is that there is no such regulation. There's still Aktiengesetz, but in that specific law, you simply cannot issue a token. It's a share, and probably for a couple of months it will still be a share. It's different in Switzerland, and that also makes it difficult to issue, for example, equity tokens. But we're speaking also about the evolution of the entire industry, so we will cover that in the presentation as well. So what is an asset-backed token? That's very interesting. As I already said, it's very similar to exchange-traded commodities, to, basically anything of certificate or index fund, wherever an underlying is involved, but not as professional as it should be. So we've seen currencies like Tether, which is backed by US dollars. At least this is what they say. Hopefully, yeah, absolutely. Very interesting that they still refuse to grant any audits, that the underlying is actually existing in that specific reserve account. But the idea is quite nice, to just attach a token to an underlying to decrease volatility, but also increase security, decrease the risk. So this is the idea behind it. In the professional market, we have trustees, we have reserve accounts, which are completely isolated from the issue of that certificate, because that basically reduces or eliminates completely the counterpart risk. It's completely different in that new industry, but that has to change in order to professionalize the entire market, and it will sooner or later. But it also just underlines that we're at the very beginning. And then some very interesting developments we've seen: gold, a gold-backed token, diamonds on the blockchain, which is nothing else than just the underlying is a diamond. And I'm really getting excited about real estates because there's a clear benefit to that one. So for example, 1 square meter can be put into the form of a token, and that makes it fungible, that makes it liquid in terms of tradability. So that's very interesting. It's a fantastic use case, real estate, and I'm coming to a few examples after that slide. Investment funds as well. So like ETFs, exchange traded funds, exactly the same can happen just in form of a token, but far more efficient, quicker to issue, and better in the handling. And I personally get very excited about energy because the security token offering that we took on board last year is in the fields of renewable energy. And also in that course of the presentation, want to make it very clear, the security token offering is at the moment not really applicable to all fields and all industries. There are only very few, a very limited number of industries you can actually use a security token for. And one is definitely the renewable energy field. That's also one thing why we made the decision to take that specific ICO on board. There's also another very important reason. The company is planning to do an IPO in parallel. So the entire due diligence basically was already performed. And that was also very important for us as a sort of a quality certificate. Because you never know, you definitely need that professionalism in the industry, which usually VCs, private equity investors bring in. And the IPO was basically the best signaling that that company could do on the market. And this is something we want to use in the course of the STO as well. As I already said, the advantages are quite obvious. Through attaching an underlying to the token, you decrease volatility, you increase security in terms of in terms of bankruptcy risk. Because if the issuer of the certificate, well, at least so the theory says, if the issuer of the certificate goes bankrupt, you still have the underlying.
Is there a reason for that to attribute a value to the token?
Yeah, so...
But I mean, how can you then trade or sell? How does that work?
Yeah. So let's take gold, for example. Why have we started to issue ETCs, exchange-traded commodities on gold? Because gold, because it's a physical asset, is not easy to trade. And ultimately, the value is determined by the price of gold, for example. And it's just a one-to-one conversion. So the token is always exactly worth what, well, more or less, what the underlying is worth. And it's just an instrument to make gold fungible, make it tradable. And that's the entire idea behind it. Same, for example, for real estate. It's very difficult to sell one piece of real estate It's a big chunk, and you can't cut it into smaller pieces. But if you just attach a token to it, and the value of all tokens together is basically the fair market evaluation of the entire real estate, it gets fungible. You can sell 1 square meter of that specific real estate, and you don't have to sell the entire real estate in a one-off transaction. So that's the idea behind it. That's the idea behind asset-backed tokens. And it's nothing new, to be honest. This is exactly what the industry is already doing for like 15 years. Now it's not called ETC or ETF or certificate, it's just called token. It's just a different instrument, technically also quite differently. The disadvantage, yeah?
So would you say Tether is already an asset-backed token? Right?
Allegedly, yeah. So it is.
The other day we heard the exchanges are not allowed to trade security tokens right now. So
absolutely.
You can buy on every exchange. So
Yeah.
is that possible?
Yeah, that is a very good question. We've dealt with this issue at the very beginning of the ICO, because if it's classified as a security, you're not allowed to trade it on the existing exchanges. You need a completely regulated exchange that makes sure that all regulations with regard to secondary market compliance are fulfilled. We are currently speaking to GTEC in Gibraltar, which will be a completely regulated security exchange. But at the moment, there are nearly no security exchanges existing. And that's a big risk, because apparently Tether is not classified as a security. That's the only explanation I've got, because otherwise, why would you be able to trade it? And this is also something I want to address in that pitch, that the regulation is very uncertain about the current developments in the market, and something has to happen to just help fostering a sustainable industry. The SEC just said that basically all ICOs performed are security token offerings. This is something that just recently happened. And on the other side, Germany just said Bitcoin is not a security. So it's just very slowly happening at the moment. That makes life difficult for us, because we have to prepare for the worst. And this is what we're doing with this security token offering as well. And the secondary market tradability is also a big issue currently when issuing a security token offering.
And when you say you're prepared for the worst, would it be that there's something like a big bang where lots of currencies that are, or tokens and coins were right now listed on exchanges suddenly get like this stamp security token and get delisted from exchanges?
Yeah, could happen.
And then this would be horrible for everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Is there something like, because I'm investing in some coins, is there something like a list where you can see, okay, this is the risk of this coin being...
No, and I tell you why. Because it's not regulated. No prospectus, nothing. No law firm has approved that one in the worst case. So yeah, it could absolutely happen.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, sure. By preparing for the worst, I meant something different. I meant that we're treating that security token, regardless of whether there's any chance that it might be classified as a utility token, strictly as a security token. That means we went through the entire process, and this process is still ongoing, of issuing a security. Prospectus, notification of the authorities, investor protection, so everything. It's like issuing a security, nearly like doing an IPO. And apparently the big advantage of utility tokens is it's quite easy to issue, because you just say, look, it's anyway not applicable to any laws, we just issue it. But there's definitely a risk that at some point in time the authorities turn around and say, look, this is no utility token, this is clearly a security token. And then you're talking about liability, you're talking about refunding your investment, you're talking about delisting, you're talking about blacklisting that company, everything that's basically a consequence of breaking the law.
So what are you telling currently your potential investors about the tradability of the token they buy?
Yeah, nothing, because we have no written statement that our token will be listed on one of the exchanges, not yet. We can say that we're currently speaking to GTEC, for example, and a few other exchanges currently being in the stealth mode that will be able to trade security tokens. But because we have to prepare prospectus, we cannot make any statements which are not 100% confirmed. So no statement at all with regard to tradability on a secondary market.
But I guess this raises questions on the investor side,
Yeah.
they think about whether they should buy it. So
Yeah.
what's your experience with that?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's not their major concern. That's very interesting because we mainly speak to institutional investors, and they have a lot of other questions as well. So they perform a complete due diligence on you. The roadshows that we made are completely different to ICOs, and the questions they ask are far more challenging, which is good because if you can answer those questions, you prove, well, it's a due diligence.
Can you give us an example?
Yeah, sure. So for example, we're issuing a security token on that specific company, and the investors ask, what happens to the security token if somebody buys the company, the underlying, the asset? Could you show me, please, the articles of incorporation, where it's basically stipulated this token is irrevocably attached to the company? So this is one question. Another question is how you deal with conflicts of interest, because you're also doing an IPO in Australia, but now doing an STO in Europe. How does that work? Do we get the profits that are supposed to be sent to the investor of the IPO? So this kind of questions. They're completely screening the entire IPO team. And of course, they ask questions about secondary market fungibility. But that's something we cannot not answer yet.
So you mentioned about renewable energy is one of the few industry that can use security tokens. Can you elaborate a little bit more with some real cases?
Yeah. So I'll do that in a second when we look at a different financing model. So we do a quick lesson on corporate finance, and then I'll tell you why renewable energies is probably a very good field to start issuing a security token. Just a few examples about asset-backed tokens. I really like the Atlant project, by the way. A very smart idea. So you'll be able to just buy a very small chunk of real estate all around the world. Regulation made me a little bit concerned, but I liked the project. At the end, I didn't invest because I thought, well, how will regulation probably see that project in a couple of months? So, small lesson on corporate finance. Very easy. We have debt, and we have equity, and we have mezzanine. Mezzanine is basically something in between, which can be dependent on the exact structuring, more equity, and hence a security, or it can be more debt. Debt is usually where I would classify security tokens as a debt, and I'll tell you why. Because during a utility token offering, you basically just issue a payment equivalent, something that might has a value in the future, but it helps you to fund your project. So basically, you tell tokens, and that token can be used to buy a service in the future. So that's quite clear for utility token, and that's a debt. That's nothing else than a debt. The investors are giving you a loan. They just invest in your company by granting you a loan, and in return, they get a utility token. It's basically nothing else than just a sort of financing of your project. They get something in return, which is a transaction, but it's more debt. And then we've got equity, a share. That's standard equity. You buy a chunk of that company. You own that company to a specific amount, and you have rights, for example, like voting rights. You can influence how the board of directors is set. And then we've got mezzanine, which is in Germany quite common, Genussrechte, Nachrangdarlehen. So it's something in between. And this is a sort of gray area. And this is exactly where renewable energy financing can be positioned. So mezzanine financing is quite common in the fields of renewable energies. So usually it's just something like debt, but you can participate on the profits the company is generating, but without any voting rights. You're not actually buying a specific part of the company, you just buy a right. And that right grants you the right to participate on the profits of that company. And that's a perfect example of mezzanine. And that's very common in the renewable energy field. So issuing a security token, at least the instrument, a Genussrecht, for example, is very, very well known by the investors. Now it's just not called Genussrecht, it's called token, but legally it's exactly what the investors already know. And this is why we've decided to do a security token offering in the fields of renewable energies, because the mezzanine financing is already quite common in that field. And equity is different. And I also tell you my concerns with regard to equity and how long it probably will take until a first true equity token will be issued in Germany. It's different in Switzerland because regulation adapted. It's possible to issue shares on the blockchain as a token, but in Germany it isn't. And it's also very interesting. These are just the different stages and when the specific funding applies. So at the very early stage, we have the founders funding and angel finance. And then later on, early stage, but it can also happen at the very beginning, we've got venture capital and then private equity. This is interesting because in the course of the presentation, I want to elaborate whether a security token offering can really substitute or be an instrument for venture capitals and private equity investors. And I also want to share some of our experiences in dealing with those investors on the roadshows. And then we've got at the very bottom public debt. So that's basically debt. And here we've got the different instruments of equity, and then we've got mezzanine, as I already told you. And very interesting are the fields venture capital and private equity for security token offerings in the future. And as we already see it on the market, mezzanine capital. Just to know and just to show you to which stages that apply. So in theory, it's basically exactly the stage an ICO takes place in. So it makes sense as an instrument of funding. Whether the industry and whether the investors are already prepared to deal with tokens and invest in such projects, that's a completely different story. The difference between ICOs and IPOs, just very briefly, I'd rather compare a security token offering to an IPO in terms of complexity. It's not as complex as an IPO, but far more complex than an ICO. Probably it's somewhere in between, but closer to an IPO than to an ICO. So an ICO is basically a white paper website. If you're lucky, the company you're investing in has already a prototype and existing clients, but that's basically an exception on the market. So it's a white paper website. And whilst performing an IPO, you have filings with the authorities, you have to prepare prospectus, a registration statement. This is everything that we also have to prepare for our security token offering. So this is something which is a pain from a project perspective and far more complex than we've expected when we took that project on board. But I really have to say that it's also something good because it just is a sort of quality stamp for your project, and it helps to professionalize the entire industry. So I'm really embracing that one, although it makes life far more complicated for startups in raising capital. But it's also something good for the industry. And we really wanted to go through that process.
So in the next slide, you're going to basically show us what's in the column for the STO, yeah? Because you left the STO out here.
Yeah, correct. So I'm going to elaborate on that one as well. But sort of as an introduction, I wanted to quickly state that it's more comparable to an IPO than to an ICO. And there's not much difference compared to an IPO. Instead, that you don't need an underwriter for your transaction. The price mechanism is different compared to an IPO, depending on the pricing model. But in terms of regulation, it's definitely quite common to that one. The roadshow is also very interesting. So we've been roadshowing in London last week, and we're flying to Singapore, Hong Kong, and Sydney in July. And we've learned a lot about this pre-test in London because investors are asking completely different questions compared to an ICO. Their due diligence is far more challenging than what we've ever expected with regard to an ICO. So that is also a very good lesson we're currently going through. But to answer your question finally, basically in terms of regulation, it's very similar to an IPO, but the pricing mechanism is different. So it's a fixed pricing that you set, a fixed discount structure that you set, quite similar to an ICO. And during an IPO, it's different. It depends on the auction mechanism, but this is the main difference. And also, there is no such thing as an underwriter for ICOs or security token offerings. That's, by the way, a very interesting niche on the global market that we're trying to address in our company as well. but they are roadshow managers. So we are cooperating with local companies that came from the IPO tech business, for example, in Sydney, and they organize the roadshows for our security token offering. Funnily enough, it's basically the same target group, so tech investors that are now just dragged into those security token offering roadshows. But they apply exactly the same due diligence that they usually apply to investing in tech shares whilst listed to an exchange. Yeah. So I have to look at the time, so we keep that one quite brief. The message here is it's very interesting how also the process of an ICO changed. And I just want to share my theory on that one with you. You don't have to agree necessarily, but I'll come to that in a second. So at the beginning of 2017, we started with announcement and public sale. There were, well, just rarely things like pre-sale, like airdrops. And later on in 2017, we had the pre-sale, but the main sale was basically still the important phase to raise the majority of your capital. In 2018 and at the end of 2017 that ended, we had seed investing. That's, by the way, also very interesting. So before starting your ICO, many companies, just to finance the ICO project as well, want to get one seed investor on board. And we're speaking currently to quite a few venture capital investors that apparently want to invest in the seed phase, but not in the ICO phase. And the reasons for that, I will also talk about the reasons for that. But it's a mixture now of traditional venture capital in the seed phase and then the ICO phase later on. So that's also a new dimension that was added to the entire ICO process. And then, and this is quite important, at the end of 2017 and beginning of 2018, something changed. So the private sale became more important for ICO projects. And I'll tell you why, because institutional investors entered the game. You're speaking now to fewer investors with higher investment tickets. So the private sale is at the current stage the most important phase of the ICO, and Telegram is probably the best example for that one. So they've just raised 2 billion in a private sale with only a few investors, and then just canceled the main sale because there was no need for a main sale at all. And to be honest, I would do exactly the same. If it's possible to just finance your entire project in the private sale with only dealing a few investors, no community management, then I would do it. So, to give you one example, a venture capitalist usually cannot deal with tokens. That's the one thing.
The process in general, because it's a closed shop deal.
Yeah.
So you have private sale.
Yeah.
So the main sale is not going to happen.
Yeah.
So what's the structure then?
It's just basically the same. It's the same deal flow, the same process. It's not called venture capital. It's just a token and a slightly different peer group. Yeah.
It's not a public sale anymore. It's like private equity or venture capital deal at the end.
It is.
Quite a few investors, and it's done. And they receive a huge discount on
Yeah.
the trade.
Yeah.
And then they go public, and what's then?
Yeah, correct. What's then? That's a good question. So in terms of the process, it's quite similar to the stages of venture capital or traditional corporate financing, but the instrument is completely different because it's a token.
Additional question. You told us about the specific properties of a security token and the comparison to Genussschein or Genussrecht.
Yeah.
Is quite clear, and I still don't understand why should I take security. I see it's a different technical background. What for? First step, I get mezzanine capital.
Yep.
As an investor, and the second step, as just said, it is a closed shop event. What is the value added?
Yeah, fungibility.
Fungibility.
Correct. Fungibility and a completely streamlined and standardized issuance process.
Okay.
That's the benefit. And we've also learned that this is not enough for institutional investors during the roadshows. Just issuing mezzanine in this very new world is not enough. You have to give them more. You have to give them something, an intrinsic or a sort of inherent value of that token, which is attached to the technology. So just saying you get a Genussrecht and hereby the token is not enough. They also want to do something with that token in the ecosystem, and that's a challenge. And that is also one of the major challenges we had during that security token offering. But yeah, that's a major advantage.
Follow-up question to that. So what's the add-on value they wanted?
Yeah. So for that specific project, we basically financed this new company, which will be found in Gibraltar, for a variety of reasons. The financing is done by the security token offered. But it's renewable power plants, and we're planning to develop a platform on Corda, which will be connected to those power plants. And on that platform, you'll be able to exchange energy peer-to-peer via another token, which will be issued one-to-one in the proportion of the security token you've got. So basically what we're doing is we're issuing a security token, a Genussrecht, as financing of the entire project, and then all equity investors will also get a utility token which allows them to trade on that platform energy peer-to-peer. So, and this is something we had to do because just approaching investors with security token is in the current stage not enough. That's not enough because the peer group, the target group is completely different to traditional investors.
Can you tell us something about the equity investors in this stage? What kind of investors?
We've got high net worth individuals that are interested in renewable energies. We've got family offices. We've got even funds we're currently speaking to. They are all very interesting, but sooner or later we always come to the point, this specific fund says, yeah, we're focused on renewable energy, but how to deal with that token? How can I put that token into my account? How to store that token? How to put it in custody? And that's the major challenge. So a very nice vehicle, a very nice instrument in terms of efficiency, but still some of the investors are not prepared for that. And this is our experience we've made in London, massively. So all investors absolutely like the project, but they're simply not capable of dealing with the token and handling the token. It's different in Asia Pacific, but that makes life very complicated. Yeah, so you have a lot of custodians, for example, in Asia Pacific. Most of them use legacy trust in Hong Kong, for example. Even the family offices are in positions to just put their tokens in custody for their clients. Yeah. So yeah, we've spoken about that one. There will be a change. So with more institutional investors entering the market, sooner or later the public sale will for quite some time become obsolete because it will be just a private sale. Only a few investors with larger ticket size will fund the project, but we're not there yet. This will sooner or later change. So we're at the very beginning. This is also something I want to just make very clear in that presentation. Yeah, thinking about the platform, I think it's quite clear, ERC20, that's the token of your choice. Eventually, we'll be in a position to issue a token on Corda, which I personally would like to do, but we're not there yet. Just some stats which we probably skipped. That's important, 4 billion, 6 billion now, end of March, that's nothing. That's just looking at the ticket size, the market is still so small, just to put that in relation.
Quick question back to Corda. As I understood, Corda is not a public blockchain technology or backend, let me say it that way. And you are offering the investors that say can deal or able to deal with these tokens. I do not understand these connections to this security token which you are offering, and then it must be linked to these tokens in your ecosystem, or
yeah, so that's the idea. I mean, this is very project specific. I briefly answered that one, but I'm happy to talk you through all the details of that project after the presentation. So the idea is basically to issue a utility token which can be used as a medium for payment on that platform. But Corda is far more efficient in terms of peer-to-peer energy trading. And we're currently looking at interoperability between Ethereum, link it to some sort of token, and Corda. So there are different approaches that we're currently investigating to do that. A quarter token per se is not as easy handleable as a ERC20 token is. So there are different models we're currently looking at, but that's simply the idea. 2 tokens, 1 equity token or 1 security token. It's not equity, it's a security token, 1 utility token. And the challenge of that project is to combine them, to attach value to the security token by adding a new functionality to the utility token and give a kicker basically for investors to invest in that one. Broaden the target group of that ICO or of that security token offering. Why are ICOs interesting for investors? I mean, it's the return. That's the simple answer. Whether it's driven by speculation or whether it's a fair value, that's something completely different. But just looking at the stats, we've analyzed 100 ICOs, and the average over return, and I was quite surprised by that figure because I thought it's definitely lower than that, is nearly 70% since the date of issuing the token until now. Of course, there are some total losses. I mean, also, no surprise. Yeah, volatility. I mean, volatility attracts investors, but also is a massive risk. Yeah, it's 450% volatility. It's just massive. But this is how the industry works. And this is something you're trying to reduce by putting an asset, attaching an asset to a token, decrease volatility. Because just imagine that token. Today I want to buy a coffee, which is probably cost me $4, and then the price goes up by 100%. On the other day, it costs $8. That makes no sense at all. So it's completely useless for any transactions in the real industry. And this is something that also has to change. Yeah, daily returns. If you're a day trader, it's probably the best to trade with tokens at the moment. Correlations. That's also very interesting. Just look at the column on your left-hand side. There's a massive correlation still between all tokens and Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is still dominating the entire industry. Basically, the message is, if Bitcoin goes up, most of the tokens go up. If Bitcoin goes down, most of the tokens go down. So also very simple. It's different or slightly different with asset-backed tokens. And also a message is, I mean, this is just a small analysis. We've analyzed the 10 biggest currencies. There are correlations, but they're not consistent and constant over time. So you absolutely cannot do anything with the figures and the findings of correlations. So that's also a very interesting message. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you've learned a lot about how to perform successful ICOs, so we skipped that one as well. There are still scam ICOs, also a few examples how to identify scam. By now you should also have learned a lot about that one. And that's interesting. This is basically how the entire market evolved over the last couple of years. So now is a very interesting time for everybody to deal with ICOs because we have institutional investors entering the market. The very tech-savvy, early adopter institutional investors invested in utility tokens. And now the new institutional investors entering the market are looking for more regulated instruments. And one of those instruments can be a security token, but there are still only a very few that are capable of dealing with such securities in form of a token. But that will change sooner or later. We also have, regardless of the entire ICO industry, funds. We have tokenized funds, we have single asset funds. I'm currently speaking to a big fund manager in Singapore, and they've been approached by a consortium of institutional clients that wanted to invest in one specific ICO. And as I told you, those institutional clients didn't feel comfortable in dealing with the token. So basically, they've asked the fund manager to set up a fund. With this specific fund, only buy that specific token, put that token in custody, and then issue the fund to the investors or even certificates on that one, which is just completely insane because the entire efficiency gain you usually should have through a token is vanished by just using a traditional vehicle in order to invest. And that's just representative for the entire market. This is where we are. There's an appetite on the institutional side, but they're still not well enough educated and prepared for dealing with tokens. That will change, but that's a very funny story. And by the way, I think their target was to invest 40 million US dollars, and by accident, they raised 80 million, and now they're looking for new security token offering opportunities. This is just an example how Singapore, or how the world in Singapore works. Insane. Instead of tokenizing funds, they just use a traditional vehicle. I still don't get it, but yeah. Yeah, this is also another comparison. ICOs, utility tokens, 3 to 6 months. VC, 3 to 12, IPOs over 1 year. We wanted to do our security token offering in 9 months. It probably takes 12 months. So it's slightly different than doing a utility token, issuing a utility token. How is the industry changing? So these are VC investments in the US, total figure, sources CB Insights and Statista. 2017 beginning was dominated by pure venture capital investments. Now this is changing. I'm not speaking about completely substituting the venture capital industry, but you see the fundraising via ICOs is increasing constantly. And the more professional the market gets, the higher I believe the chance be that venture capital eventually will be completely substituted. But this will take some time. Yeah, that's basically just other stats, but same message. The ratio increases. ICO is more common, or gets more common. Venture capital is still important, but ICOs are starting to sort of replace specific parts of venture capital. That's also very interesting, and this is what I've said. This is mainly driven by institutional clients or clients with more capital entering the market. In 2018, February, and these are the latest figures. And just within 1 month, this happened. So we had 41% financed in a private sale. Now in March, it's 62% financed in a private sale. So as I said, the private sale phase becomes more and more important. So security token offerings. And this is why would an investor prefer a security token instead of venture capital and private equity? The message is very clear. Fungibility, because you have smaller sizes. Accessibility. So you don't have to invest a big size of, let's say, 1 million, because the transaction costs are so high for venture capital investors investing in a company, due diligence, the entire contract negotiations, changing the articles of incorporation, the shareholders agreement. That's just a pain and causes massive transaction costs. And you don't do that for just 100 euros or 1,000 euros or even 100,000 euros. If you don't have a standardized process in place. And that's basically it. So ticket size reduces, which means eventually every one of us will be in a position to invest €1, for example, venture capital in a startup. This is nowadays completely impossible. And this is something a token or the blockchain in principle can massively change. Fungibility as well. Have you ever tried to sell off a venture capital investment? It's impossible. I mean, German startup group did something very interesting this week. They've launched their secondary market trade platform to basically try and generating fungibility for their investments. But usually venture capital investors have to wait until another big private equity deal is done or even for the IPO. And this will completely change with security tokens in place because you invest in the early stage and after the listing, you'll be able to just sell off your investment on a company. It depends on the price, always. But if the company is performing well, for example, if that security token is attached to profits of the company, then that's the theory, regardless of any speculation. Any market trading alpha generated, the price of the token will also increase. And this applies for venture capital in particular, but can sooner or later also apply for private equity. Private equity is slightly different. I don't see any use case for tokenized private equity yet, because it's far more complex, contracts are more individual, but venture capital investors on the other side are also more tech savvy. They're more they are more willing to take risks on board, and that's something also which is just caused by the industry they're operating with. They're trying to be early adopters in all fields. So first of all, I see venture capitalists investing through security token offerings, and then after that phase was successfully completed, private equity investors will follow. But not both at the same time, because private equity investments are completely different in some regards compared to venture capital investments. Yeah, and to close that one, fungibility and ticket size. These are the main advantages of using tokens.
But on what exchange platform would that be? For example, there are so many exchange platforms are not regulated anyway.
Yeah.
And then, for example, Japan also issued the law, and then they have to delist
Yeah. Yeah.
coins.
Yeah.
So what the security token, as per what you said, is more kind of legalized, more
Yeah.
kind of secured. But then, on which platform would that happen?
Yeah. So from a legal perspective, it is any regulated exchange, like for example, Börse Frankfurt, Börse München, Börse Stuttgart. This is the license you need to trade security tokens, because they're security. With regard to the infrastructure, those exchanges won't be able to deal with tokens. But we have GSX in Gibraltar, which will be able to deal with securities from a technical perspective, and also are currently applying for the license to do so. We have SCX in Switzerland, a very interesting project. Börse Stuttgart is experimenting with Bison. They start with cryptocurrencies, but it might also end up in trading security tokens. And we're currently speaking to at least 2 exchanges that want to, that are in a stealth mode, that want to also apply for a license. And there are even considerations of big exchanges like Binance getting a license. So, and this is also a very strong indicator that the industry is about to change. And another theory from my side, which I find personally very interesting. So we had shares, then we had tech shares, and then ever since 2000 we had this entire exchange-traded fund, ETC, index fund discussion. I mean, can you imagine what happened back at the beginning of 2000 when the first ETFs, ETCs were issued? I mean, all the investors were claiming that's just massively increasing the risk of the entire industry. Stability is threatened. And nowadays, this is the preferred investment vehicle in the entire wealth management industry. So, and I have the theory that sooner or later, ETFs, ETCs, index funds will be replaced by tokens. But I'm not quite sure when this is going to happen, because it's completely dependent on the regulator and the professionality of the entire industry. But I think eventually it might happen.
In what timeline are you thinking? 5 years, 10 years?
5 to 10 years. At the earliest in 5 years. But that's probably later than that. It will take some time. These are the infrastructural points of a security token offering. Absolutely same like an ICO. Probably a smart contract is slightly different. The new aspect here is the regulation. It's the legal setup of security token offerings and the investor relations. But from a technical perspective, it's exactly the same like doing an ICO. My conclusion, to also finish that presentation off, this is what we've learned the hard way during our roadshow trips. First of all, it takes considerably longer doing that project than we've expected. And that's mainly caused by law firms that have no experience at all with issuing security tokens, at least in Europe. This is something very new. When we've started this project, we wanted to issue the first security token in Europe. I'm not quite sure whether we will be in a position to issue the first one, but this also comes along with quite some disadvantages, because try to identify a law firm that feels comfortable enough issuing a security in form of a token. That was quite some interesting experience. That's the other thing. Then the other side is issuing a security usually costs, well, let's say, preparing the prospectus, notifying the authorities, dealing with the authorities, 100K. Just because it's now called security token offering, law firms start charging you 300,000, 400,000. That's a real pain, because they just price in the risk. This is also something that we've experienced. So something becomes very clear here. Without any seed funding, it's impossible to do a security token offering. That's also something that we've learned. Luckily enough, that company is already well funded. As I said, it's planning to do an IPO. So this is something that we could deal with. But for a startup, impossible without seed funding. Then we thought this is a cakewalk. We just go to the roadshow, tell them this will be the first security token offering in Europe. We also managed to attach a utility token to that one, and they just start investing. Yeah, forget it. They started asking questions, uncomfortable questions, like, for example, what happens if the company gets sold? What happens to my token? Can you prove that the board of directors has significant experience in that industry? What is your role? Who will audit your smart contracts? Who is the advisor of that one? Is it Ernst & Young? Is it one of the big fours? Well, we don't know that law firm. Could you please provide us with references of that law firm? Can I see the contracts? Can I influence the contracts? Is it just buying the token? Is that a standardized agreement, or can I put my individual clauses in that contract? No, you can't, because token offering is just about standardization. Yeah, then I don't want to invest. And a few of them said, okay, all right, I don't want to buy your token, but can I give you seed money with a standard investors agreement? Yeah, very helpful. But this is the experience that we've made. Different target groups. So they are tech-savvy, high net worth individuals, and it's easy to deal with them because they've already invested in some utility tokens, but their investment capability is usually, if you're lucky enough, 1 to 2 million, but you want to speak about the big sizes, institutional investors. And the problem here that we've experienced is they all are interested in the project, but they're simply not capable of dealing with that token. And then they start asking questions, if I invest, could you put my token in custody? Could you just take care of the tokens? Could you just set up the entire wallet to do that? How does that work? Can you just help us? Difficult. We might have a conflict of interest here. But this is also something that we've learned. So I totally get that point why that fund decided to invest in the ICO and then just sell off the fund to the investors. I get that point after I had the discussions. And then the big problem, which we've already discussed, is secondary market fungibility. You cannot announce any potential listing during the security token offering because there's simply no exchange already existing that would be able to list your tokens. There are different options. We have soft commitments from those secondary market exchanges. By the way, it's also good to have one of the first security token offerings because you get listed for free. Because, well, they want to have at least one security token listed on their exchange. So you're not paying massive amounts to get listed on one of the big exchanges. That's also one advantage. To close that, really, it will take some time. It will definitely take some time because it's the adaptation of institutional investors is still very slow. They still are focused on traditional vehicles for investing in that new industry. The majority of them has really issues and struggles to deal with that new token and with that new instrument called token. And I still don't regret the decision to took that security token offering on board because it's fantastic for learning, but it probably will take a few more years until the security token becomes a completely recognized instrument for institutional investors. So it depends completely on the industry you're in, but you should definitely consider when doing your ICO, is a security token offering the right instrument? Or do I stick to a utility token? And then it's even more important if you have decided to do a utility token that you get the regulation right. So you cannot issue any utility token that can be interpreted as a security token later on. So it's very, very wise and important to invest in legal advice here, because there is a massive risk that your token later on gets blacklisted, or even worse, your company gets shut down and you get sued. So if you have any questions with regards to security tokens offering, I'm happy to answer them after the presentation. Just drop me an email. Yeah, happy to help.